Hello everybody, and welcome back to this YouTube series on SQLAlchemy. In this video, I'll show you how to perform CRUD operations, and CRUD does stand for create, read, update, and delete. From the last video, we created an app class that had the user model and our engine inside of it. I moved those over to the models.py file to kind of get it out of the way and keep it organized. But in our app.py, we will import user and engine from our models class that we made. We will need both of these in order to perform CRUD operations. So first of all, we'll get started with creating a new record. In order to do that, we'll need a session. So from SQLAlchemy.orm, we will import session maker. Then we will create a session object with a capital S and set it equal to session maker. This bind will basically just tell the session where it should be making these transactions. So which database it should be connecting to and performing all these actions. We'll make another session variable with a lowercase s, and we'll set it equal to session with the capital S that we just made with open and close parentheses. This will return us an actual session object that we can now use to perform actions on. So now that we have a session, let's create a new user. So first up, we'll create a user object and we'll set it equal to user from our class in our models.py file. And we have open and close parentheses. So we can create it just like this and it'll work perfectly fine, but we will go ahead and add in a couple variables here. So for this, we have name equals John Doe and age is 30. And after we've created our user object, we need to add it to our session. And then we need to commit it with session.commit in order to actually make these transactions go through. So whenever we run it, as you can see, there's no output. So if you go over to our database explorer, we click it, we can see our database with our users table. We'll go and click on this table and it'll fetch us all the rows. So here we have the new entry we just made of John Doe with age of 30. And you see it gave it an ID of 1 automatically for us. So it is pretty straightforward and pretty simple to add new records to the database. But let's create some more. So here we've created users 2, 3, and 4, all with different names and varying ages. So here we can do the .add, and it does add one object at a time. But if we want to add multiple at the same time, we can do session.addAll and pass it a list of objects to add to the database. Then we'll just do session.commit. And whenever we run it, we can see the output, nothing outputted, but we'll go back to our table. And we can see there are now 4 entries in this table of all the ones we just created. So cool, now you know how to create entries in the database. Now let's talk about accessing data in the database. So to do this, we have to use our session object. We do .query. And in query, it'll have open and close parentheses, and you put the class that you want to query. So in this case, user, and it will query the user table. And we can do .all to get all of the records. So whenever we run this, it'll print out all the records that it's gotten. And you can see we did get a list of 1, 2, 3, and 4 records. So now that we have this data, we can access it just like accessing elements in a list. So if we get index position 0 of users and we run it, it will return us this one specific user object. So for this case, we'll set user equal to users of 0 for that first user index. Then we will print that user. We will print the ID of the user. We'll also print the name of the user and the age. So going back to our models file, in this user class, we can access any of these columns just by performing a dot and the column name. So whenever we run it, we now get the user object, the ID, the name, and the age all printed out to the console. So something else that you can do that is pretty cool is you can loop through each of these and access each of their elements. So for this case, we're doing for user and users. So we're looping through each user in this list that we're getting from the database. And we're printing out the user ID, the name, and the age of each user. So whenever we run it, you can see it does print out each one right here. So another thing we can do is we can filter down the results that we're getting to meet specific use cases. So here we're adding this dot filter by, and we can specify a parameter equals to something that we want to look for. So in this case, we have ID because back in our models class, we have an ID right here. And since we know it is an integer, we can set equal to 1 because we want to get the user with the ID of 1. And so printing out the user ID, name, and age, we can go ahead and run this. Whenever we run it, it is returning a list of users with the ID equals 1. And since it's just 1, we can actually replace this .all with 1 or none. This will either return one object or none if there's no objects that meet our criteria. So if we run this again, instead of returning a list, it will actually return us the actual object. So now this would be user, and whenever we run it, we get the specific user with the ID of 1. Now, if you happen to be searching for something that's not unique, or there's multiple records, then this will return an error. So for example, we're filtering by age equals 25. If we look back in our database, we can see that we have 2 entries with 25 as their age. So whenever we run it, it does return an error since multiple rows were found when 1 or none was required. It's just something to keep in mind if you're using this one. So if we change the 1 or none to .all and we run it, we can see that it is a list of 2 objects. We can actually just access the first one instead of getting the second one, just by replacing this all with first. So whenever we run it, it just returns us that first object. And from there, we can access its variables and do whatever we want with it. All right, so now we'll move on to updating records. So in this case, we're querying the user table and we're getting the user with the ID of 1. So whenever we run it, we do get the user and we get their name. So something we can do is we can change their name. So if I'm saying user.name equals a different name, we can now print it and it does change their name. But if we go back into the database and we run it, nothing's changed over here. So in order to fix that, we need to commit the changes. So since we've added session.commit, it will now save our changes. So whenever we go ahead and run this, you can see what the original name was, what the change name was, and we go to our database table and we execute, you can see that it was changed to a different name. So now it's saved the changes. Awesome. So another thing we can do is we can delete records as well. We can do this by typing session.delete and then the specific record that we want to delete. So in this case, we have that original user with ID equals 1. So in our database, we can see that we have 4 entries. And whenever we run this, all right, cool. We go back into the database table, we run it, and now we're missing that first user. So that is how you delete users from the tables. Cool, and that's it. Now you know how to perform CRUD operations using SQLAlchemy. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you learned something new. Leave a like and subscribe, and stay tuned for more.